Welcome back to the Spy X Family Comparison Series. Today we'll cover episode 3, which adapts the entirety of chapter 3. While the first 2 episodes also covered just 1 chapter each, those chapters had abnormally long page counts, whereas every chapter after this is more conservative in its length, and since this episode in particular only covers one of those much shorter chapters, that means that there's a lot of empty space that needs to be filled. To help with that, the episode actually starts off by adapting the introductory title page from chapter 1 with all the same narration and everything. I'm honestly surprised when looking at these side by sides. The illustrations here are just about as picture perfect as it gets. Pretty smart that the anime decided to hold off on adapting this until after we officially met the 3 family members. But then again, it's probably because squeezing this part into the already packed runtime of episode 1 would have been pretty challenging, something that this episode has no problem doing, even giving us a little recap afterwards of the first 2 episodes. After that and the opening, we can finally get into the first panel of chapter 3, but in a much different way, because while this panel was originally used just to set the scene, the anime also uses it as a building block for our first anime exclusive bit showing Yor getting dropped off with her stuff. It's only after Lloyd meets Yor outside and comments on how little luggage she has that we move into the next manga panel of them unpacking the boxes. The only change here is that some of those boxes have different labels on them, but the following part where the narrator introduces the family again is a lot more in depth, adding in things like their surface name, code names, and fake occupations. Once the narrator is done, Lloyd talks about how they got their marriage certificate backdated by a year, and thanks to a newly added transparent shot of Frankie, we now know exactly who forged it. After this, we get some more lines from the narrator talking about the 3 family members. Lines that would normally continue on to the next page while Yor stops Anya from toying with the death instruments, but as many of you know, this doesn't happen until much later, after Anya gives Yor a tour around the house. A tour that doesn't exist in the manga. Now, while this upcoming part is 100% filler, I for one welcome it because personally, I kinda wanna know the layout of this place since a good chunk of the series takes place here. The manga doesn't really give us any sort of establishing panels for this place, and for normal character panels, the background is usually whited out. Obviously, anime can't get away with this approach, but I still appreciate the closer attention to spatial awareness in regards to where characters perform certain tasks. Like where we got introduced to the 4th member of the family, Mr. Chimera. A cute little guy with a funny voice that Anya's had since way back when. Now while this whole tour might be filler, it's not entirely without connection to this chapter, because once we reach Yor's room and she comments on how clean it is, Lloyd and Anya tell her that they cleaned it up before she arrived. Something that we see them doing on the title page of this chapter. So instead of Anya just imagining Yor's reaction, now she gets to see it firsthand. Anya did have some trouble cleaning it up in the anime version though, something Lloyd is quick to point out to her. What Lloyd and Anya don't know though is that Yor is a bit of a cleaning connoisseur herself, leading to some jump cuts of her unloading all of her luggage in seconds, meaning that Lloyd gets an early chance to see what her brother looks like. Not that he probably doesn't know already. I like how we're already making connections to future events, and even some filler events, as after Yor brings up that she has nothing to wear for the college interview, Lloyd adds a new anime exclusive stop to the places they'll be visiting today, as well as a few other extra ones that we'll get into later. But for now, it's about time we get back into sync with the manga as Anya goes to pick up Yor's box of poisonous weapons, which in the anime are apparently strong enough to kill an elephant. Now, normally it would be here that Lloyd calls them over to start prepping for the interview, but before he says that, we'll instead move back into anime exclusive territory, watching the family get ready for their midday snack. Don't worry, this part doesn't last that long, because after Lloyd calls out Anya for messing up the cookie prep, Lloyd then recommends that they start practicing, and once again we get back into sync with the manga. This scene actually starts with some anime exclusive lines from Lloyd talking about the prerequisites of successfully entering Eden College. Actually, there's a lot of newly added dialogue to this part, along with 2 new questions from Lloyd the instructor, such as asking Anya her name and address and asking Yor about how she plans to pass the exam. Though she seems to focus a little too hard on the passing part though, and goes right for her de facto state of mind of blood and death, something Lloyd wasn't too thrilled to hear. So much so that after hearing these answers, he gets a new line saying that he's starting to lose heart as a detective, a line that he'll be repeating a lot in the future. He may be giving this a pretty decent shot, but in the manga it only took him asking 2 questions before tossing his glasses aside and walking off. While he doesn't do either of those things in the anime, he does at least have some hope of getting them educated with upper class life. And during Anya's ooting, as she calls it, he even gets some new internal monologue, assuring himself that they'll be an upper crust family by the end of this for sure. Before anything else though, Yor really should get those dark thoughts of hers in check. It'd be good not just for the interview, but for the reassurance of Anya too. These two have to work hard if they want to be seen as upper class material, so what better place to start than at the opera, where it looks like there's a guy singing now instead of a girl. Not that it matters though, Anya and Yor are just about as disengaged from this performance as anyone can get. Funny how in the anime Lloyd now looks down at the sleeping Anya before deciding it's time to move on to the next location. And that location is the museum. Inside said museum, the first thing we get is an additional line from Lloyd telling Anya to use her inside voice. Something she promptly agrees to, but still points out the booby lady in her loudest voice. While Lloyd's face alone can tell 1,000 words, the anime also added a line here reiterating that Anya shouldn't yell. At least Anya and Yor are enjoying this place more than the last one though. Especially Yor, whose head is being used to censor the guy in the guillotine. Yor definitely has an interesting appreciation for art. Now, it's normally right after this that we would move over to the nationalist rally, but instead we'll be moving into another large stretch of anime exclusive content, starting with the three of them still in the museum taking a break in the drawing center. Who would have known Anya was such a great artist? Her drawings really leave things up to the imagination, and lucky for her too, because Lloyd and Yor can't really tell that she was drawing them all along. I find it interesting how she drew a dog here though. I wonder what that could mean. While these places have been all new territory for them up to this point, this next anime-only stop is one that they're very familiar with, as it's the same tailor Lloyd and Anya met Yor at. While we already know from earlier that they're here to get a dress for Yor, we do get some bonus info, like why Yor likes the colors black and red, as well as the fact that this woman right here has no intention of having kids. We also get some intel on their next location, as they plan to commemorate this occasion by getting their first family picture taken. When they do get that picture taken, I gotta say it looks oddly similar to the title page on Chapter 2, minus Lloyd's slick hair, and Yor of course. And with that basically concludes the last big chunk of anime exclusive content this episode. That's not to say there won't be any more new things from here on out, but we will be following the manga much more closely now as the Forger family attends a speech from the Nationalist Party urging for peace amongst nations. There seems to be a bit too many negative thoughts in this crowd for Anya to handle though. Now, this can be missed in the manga, but in my opinion, the anime gave us a much better understanding of how Anya's power works, as after Lloyd notices how Anya's reacting and moves her away from the crowd, the black background turns white as Anya starts looking a little better, showing that there's a range to her mind-reading abilities. It's really the only reason she felt fine enough to scarf down her meal at the restaurant afterwards, though she doesn't make quite the same mess as she does in the manga. Yor, on the other hand, is still just as lost in her ruminations as ever. The sight of these two is pretty much what sends Lloyd off into his previously anime-exclusive line of him saying that he's losing heart as a spy, as well as some other rambling thoughts. And while those thoughts more or less play out uninterrupted in the manga, in the anime they're cut off a bit. It cuts off about like this in the English version, and exactly like this in the Japanese version. And of course, since the rest of his lines are cut off, so are his final ramblings on the next panel. While it's true that these lines of his are all in his head, the anime actually brings some of his final ramblings outside of his head as he starts whispering them to himself, bringing Yor to suggest that they should go outside and get some fresh air. Stand proud, Lloyd. This is the kind of peace you fought so hard to protect. While the manga's illustration is definitely wider and shows more, for what the anime showed, I couldn't find a single building out of place, even if the park that they're standing from looks completely different between the two versions. The park isn't the only thing that's different though, because this panel right here is adapted into a sweeping shot, showing much more than just the one building. But for the building it did adapt, it closed windows that would otherwise be open and moved the kids on the block closer to the entrance, the place that we'll see them at in a future panel. Anya really is right. Everyone from up here does look like trash. A phrase that Anya now clarifies she got from anime, the most educational platform on this planet. While this episode has been pretty tame thus far, things are about to kick up a notch as the purse snatcher finally makes his move, this time next to the kids on the street we saw earlier, before going down an anime-exclusive alleyway. This immediately stirs Yor into action, jumping down a hill to pursue the thief like any other good wife would. Cuts like this are always interesting because they have to be composed just right to look believable. Everything down to the shadows displayed on the background art of Yor getting bigger or smaller depending on the angle is something that takes a lot of fine-tuning to pull off. Those heroics aside though, Yor really didn't accomplish much in the end, besides motivating Lloyd to get involved. Heck, it even motivates Anya to help her dad find the culprit amongst the sea of overwhelming thoughts. And just like the rally they were at earlier, the dense crowds still seem to be a little too much for Anya to process. These crowds have been 3D rendered in the past, but the anime does a great job at letting them sort of just vanish into the background. Not all of these people are 3D though, like the purse snatcher that Anya just pointed out to Lloyd. And that's all Lloyd needed to hear as he activates his serious face and leaves Anya with Yor, who seems seems to be coming from a different direction this time. A more worthwhile change than you might think, because we already know she jumped down several stories, so it wouldn't make much sense for her to be coming from above then. Also, as Lloyd leaves them, he now puts his hat on top of Anya's head to hang on to, so he can jump the purse snatcher. A purse snatcher that's no longer counting the money at this point. From his lines though, he seems to already know what's in it, so he probably counted it off screen. And when Lloyd finally comes down on the bad guy, he holds nothing back, creating a shockwave with the guy's skull, leading him to spew blood and teeth everywhere. While the takedown itself is more or less the same in the anime, it has been toned down a bit brutality-wise without showing any blood or missing teeth. So just like that, the Forger family has officially saved the day, and after Lloyd picks up the purse, something we only see him do in the anime, he and his family are off to escort the old lady to the hospital, which has been renamed the Central Hospital. This old lady is so thankful that before her manga lines even start, she's already thanking them for bringing her here. Getting thanked profusely is something that Lloyd really isn't used to, and he seems to be a little more happy about it than he lets on. And once Anya realizes that her dad is kind of like a tsundere, she gets off his arm and watches Lloyd thank Yor for that little detour they took today. Though Anya never actually got off Lloyd's arm in the anime, so now she is much closer to her parents as she calls them out for flirting. Also, some of you might have noticed this, but in the anime, Anya is still holding onto the hat that her dad gave her ever since he took off to take care of the thief, something we don't see at all in the manga. Hats aside though, we're now at the final stop of the episode, home, where we actually get to see them enter now with two new lines from Anya and Lloyd reflecting on their long day as Yor looks at them both with a smile on her face. Inside, Lloyd figures they should give the mock interview another shot, and much to his satisfaction, things seem to be going a little better this time. Just a little better though. All the events of today might not have set the best example for Anya. But that's okay, because Lloyd can take solace in the fact that if the old lady thought they looked good enough, then there's still some hope for them yet. And well, that basically does it for this episode. There was a lot of added content here, and I suppose another chapter could have been added to avoid that, but I think it's important that we space it out so that certain parts like the interview next episode won't be split up too much. In that regard, episode 4 will be much more true to form, and it'll be interesting to see how Wit Studio and Cloverworks tackle it. Now, I know I say this a lot, but I would really appreciate it if you guys gave this video some support by liking, sharing, and subscribing if you haven't already. These videos take quite a lot to produce, and I want to make sure I can keep doing this as long as I'm able to. Also, check me out on Patreon if you haven't already. Any support you guys can give will be heavily appreciated. Well, that's it for me. As always, I hope you all have a fantastic day. This is Registry, signing off.